Around November 1970, I had just secured a job as an entry-level reporter for the Post-Standard, the local newspaper here in Syracuse. I was young, had my dream job, and life was good. However, just 6 weeks later, my entire world came crashing down with the arrival of one letter. To Daniel Frederick Wilson, you are hereby ordered for induction into the armed forces of the United States. I had been drafted. Despite numerous stops at various induction centers, training facilities, and Air Force bases, I was ultimately destined for Vietnam. What followed was 8 weeks of boot camp at Fort Dix. For a while, it looked like I was doomed to join the infantry. But due to my degree in journalism, there was a chance I might be able to weasel my way onto the writing staff of Stars and Stripes. Just a few days before we were due to graduate, my drill sergeant pulled me into his office with some bad news. Stars and Stripes did not need any more bodies. However, there was an opportunity for me to become a military dog handler. It wouldn't keep me out of the field completely, but according to him, all I'd have to do was roll up with my K9, sniff out a few booby traps, and after that, the engineers would roll up, and I'd be back in the rear in a hot minute. But as it turned out, all that stuff about being safely in the rear turned out to be a bunch of baloney, because me and Tack, my 3-year-old German Shepherd, ended up in more firefights than I could have possibly imagined. Tack got his name after a particularly close call that occurred on a routine patrol near Cu Chi. We were on point when suddenly Tack, who was called Rex back then, started alerting like crazy. I had never seen him act so downright scared before, and when the lieutenant saw this, he ordered his guys to unload their weapons onto the jungle ahead of us. What followed was nothing short of a storm, tearing up the foliage in front of us for a solid minute. When the fire finally stopped, nothing moved, and there was a moment where we thought the whole thing might have been a false alarm. But sure enough, as we pushed through the jungle, we found drag marks, bloody trails, booby traps, the works. If it was not for Tack, there's a chance the entire platoon would have been wiped out. He saved our lives. God dang boy. I remember one grunt saying, "The hound of yours is sharp as a tack, isn't it?" And it just sort of stuck. Tack sniffed out every single ambush we ever came up against, even the one that almost killed him. Some poor grunt managed to snag a tripwire connected to a 125mm tank shell. I don't even really remember the blast. I just remember waking up on my back with someone dragging me back through the jungle. My first thought was for Tack, and as I looked to tell the soldier dragging me to go back for my K9, I saw that it wasn't a soldier at all. It was Tack. He had one of my shoulder straps between his teeth and was dragging me back towards the relative safety of the platoon with all his might. We were putting out a lot of fire, but Charlie was giving as good as they got, and one burst of machine gun fire ripped up the ground in front of me before I watched a piece of my fatigue pants just pop open. I let out a scream loud enough to wake the dead, begging for the platoon's medic. Only the next thing I know, I hear Tack let out this almighty yelp before he dived on top of me. I had no idea what just happened, and for a second I thought he had been shot, but he had not. He was trying to shield me from the bullet. The poor little guy had no idea how the enemy was hurting me. All he knew was that he wanted it to stop, even if it meant putting his body in the way of their bullets. I tried to push him off of me. I tried to keep crawling, but he wouldn't budge. Only when the shooting died down could I shift him, but by that time, instead of getting to his feet, Tack just slumped down next to me. He was alive, just barely, and I said to the platoon commander that if he didn't put him on the medic vac with me, I'd make sure he never received K9 support again. It was a total bluff, but it sure worked. Yet it'd take some considerable amount of time and insubordination to save Tack's life. When we landed back at Da Nang, I carried Tack off the Huey myself before hollering over to the medical tent to demand one of the surgeons save his life. "Get that mud off my operating table, soldier," one of them said. "I'm a doctor, for Christ's sake, not a veterinarian." I didn't say a word in response. I just pulled out my .45, pulled back the slide, and then pointed it at his head. The surgeon looked me in the eyes and saw months of firefights, booby traps, and night patrols staring back at him. A moment of silence followed, and then the surgeon got to work saving Tack's life. I'm sure you'll be as pleased as I am to learn that he survived. It turned out to be nothing more than a few shrapnel wounds, and although it took him a while to get back on his feet, Tack did make a full recovery. The incident left the brass in a predicament. I know there was at least one lieutenant colonel who wanted me breaking rocks in Leavenworth, but then there was another who was in the middle of writing me up for a Bronze Star for having saved the lives of half of his battalion. In the end, their decision was more political and disciplinary, rather than risk angering the rest of the dog handlers in the country. The brass just scratched my Bronze Star and gave me a medical discharge instead. I couldn't have cared less about some janky medal because I left Vietnam with the one thing that really mattered to me. Due to the wounds he'd sustained in combat, Tack had to be scrapped from the military's dog program, and it looked like he was headed back to the dog pound back in the US. Unless, of course, I stepped in to take ownership of him. That's how I ended up back in Syracuse with my best friend in the world. I was an unemployed 24-year-old with a bum leg and a bad case of PTSD, but I didn't care because I had Tack with me. It took me just short of a year to get back on my feet, and fortunately, I ended up picking up where I left off at the Post-Standard after a chance meeting with the editor. I'll be forever grateful to him for giving me that opportunity, and with the structure and steady income it brought, I gradually got my life together. Then one day, he called me into his office with the proposition of a lifetime. Some editor friend of a friend in DC needed an article written. Only the prospective author had just taken ill and couldn't make the assignment. Struggling to find a replacement, he'd fruitlessly called up their New York desk, which is how it made its way to us. "What's the subject?" I remember asking. "You ever heard of those churches down in Kentucky that handle snakes during their services?" "A little," I replied. "I thought it was illegal." "Since when did the law stop anyone from doing anything, kid?" "True, but who's this piece for?" "National Geographic," he said, a smile stretching across his face. "I wouldn't want to go ahead and jinx you by saying this is your big break, but I think we both know what this is." The drive down to Appalachia was going to be one son of a gun, but since the newspaper was covering my gas money, and Tack was used to being on the move, there was nothing stopping me from getting on the road the very next morning. The drive down to Kentucky was 9.5 hours of watching featureless suburban sprawl slowly erupt into the green rolling hills of Appalachia, and by the time we got there, my ass was in a coma. Tack didn't seem to mind the journey, though. Every so often, he'd stick his head out the passenger side window to renew his spirit. That, and when it came to provisions, I had little choice but to buy him a burger at the roadside grease trap, onions, mustard, and all. We rolled into Lexington late afternoon, and to my surprise, getting information on snake-handling churches wasn't all that difficult. All it took was a few pitchers of Budweiser down at the VFW, and it had those crusty old veterans singing like canaries. They told me I'd have to look out on the eastern side of the state if I wanted to talk to any of the old snake handlers, and given that the practice was outlawed, finding them was certainly not going to be easy. That didn't bother me, though. After all, I had Tack with me, and we were used to finding things that did not want to be found. One guy, Teddy, hadn't heard of anyone handling snakes in years, but the last time he did, it was happening at the old church up in the hills. And so I set out for the eastern Kentucky hills with nothing but the name of a small hillside hamlet called Three Forks. The next morning, I was back on the road, driving in the direction of West Virginia. Somewhere by the state line, around 4 hours in, it felt like I had not just traveled 200 miles. It felt like I had traveled back in time by around 50 years. It was everything. The old Hudson trucks, dated-looking signage, and by the time I was out near Three Forks, the roads had degenerated into nothing but dirt tracks, flanked by dense, dark woods. Every so often, these claustrophobia-inducing country roads would open up into what the locals call hollows, relatively flat areas where the road is sandwiched by homes and small businesses. Frog Pond Hollow was home to the Rabbit's Foot General Store, a place that doubled as both the Hollow's gas station and barber shop. And as I pulled in to top up my gas tank, the clerk wandered out to greet me. "Not often we see New York plates around here," he said, eyeing me suspiciously from across the forecourt. I explained I was in the area on business, and that I'd appreciate some gas and a bite to eat. For $1.50, the guy brought me a plate of something he called corn pone pie, which was basically cornbread with beef chili filling, along with a plate of raw hamburger for tack. After I complimented his cooking, he nodded in appreciation before correcting me that it was his wife's, and that I told him he was a lucky man to have such a fine cook at home. He finally began to warm up to me a little when he asked what kind of business I was on. I didn't want to spoil all the goodwill by telling him that I was a reporter charged with writing a story on a neighboring community that would well end with them being arrested, so I broke it to him gently. The instant he heard that I was there to write an article about snake handling, I could tell he felt almost tricked into talking to me. "Sir, please hear me out," I countered. This country was founded on the promise of religious freedom, and the fact that snake handlers can be arrested for practicing their faith is frankly un-American. So please help me show the world that these are good people here. Help me get these people their rights back. I fought for this country's freedom in South Vietnam, and damn it, I'll fight for them here too. I think it was the last line that got him. He gave me another look over, then motioned for me to follow him inside. According to the clerk, almost everyone in Appalachia knew of at least one church that still took up serpents, as he put it, and it came as no surprise that those who practice it were still persecuted by the state. Three Forks had been the subject of a crackdown on snake handling in the mid-50s, after their pastor almost lost his life to a rattlesnake bite. Since then, they'd taken their rather unique form of worship underground. But a more pertinent question then, where are they now? Was how in the hell did their pastor survive the bite of an eastern diamondback, a snake whose venom is almost 100% fatal when untreated? Victims described the pain of being bitten by one as like two red-hot hypodermic needles piercing your skin, and the venom causing the flesh surrounding the bite to blacken and rot. Even worse, the intense swelling of the affected area is said to be one of the worst forms of pain imaginable. But snake handlers vow never to seek medical attention or take any kind of painkillers in the event that they're bitten. Instead, they put their survival in God's hands. Sometimes he comes through for them, others not. I asked the clerk if he knew of any local snakebite fatalities, but he just shook his head. They'd get bitten all right. Not often, but they do. But the way I hear it, they always seem to pull through for some reason. Who knows? Maybe the Lord really is looking out for them. It's then that I asked how I'd go about securing an invite to one of these snake handling services. The clerk just looked at me, asked what unit I served with, and then, once I confirmed, he walked into the back to make a phone call. When he re-emerged, he held a small torn-off piece of paper in his hand, one with the following note written on it: "Walk into the woods off Laurel Fork after dark. No pictures." It was all the information he had for me, but it was all I needed. That night, once the sun had fully set, me and Tack walked out of the Small Inns motel where we were staying, got into my car, and drove back down to Three Forks. The darkness gave the overgrown, rust-eaten place an ominous feel, and the closer we got to Laurel Fork, the more anxious I got. By the time we reached the dead end of Laurel Fork, and I switched on the old flashlight I kept in the glove box, I'm not afraid to admit I was downright scared. It was the first time that me and Tack had gone anywhere in the dark in an unfamiliar area since Nam, but there was something else too. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on until the following night. Like I said, I was so nervous that Tack could sense it, and he stayed glued to my heel for most of the walk. Then, after a few minutes of trudging through the darkness, I began to hear something that sounded almost like singing. Moments later, I saw a dim light shining from beyond the trees, somewhere in the distance. I got a little closer, then realized what I was looking at. It was the shape of a large revival tent set up in a small clearing, and the light was coming from the lantern of a dark, shadowy figure. Since I figured they were expecting me, I switched my flashlight back on, then slowly began to approach with Tack by my side. "Welcome, brother," the figure said. "I trust you've adhered to the terms of our agreement." "Yes, sir," I replied. "No cameras, just me and my dog." "Good," the stranger replied. "Now come meet Pastor Childers." As he lifted a tent flap, I was met with a surprising sight. I'd gotten into my head that these folks were some serpentine death cult, yet they seemed just like any other small-town congregation in America. A guy was plucking a guitar at the head of the congregation, while the worshippers sang a cheerful melody of, "When I hear that trumpet sound, I'm gonna get up out the ground. Ain't no grave gonna hold my body down." Once the musical numbers ceased, the congregation applauded the banjo player before a very distinctive-looking man took the stage. He was pale and stick-thin, with a shock of curly red hair and a fiery mustache, wearing a white button-down and black slacks. As soon as he came into view, Tack's ears shot up and he softly began to growl. "Brothers and sisters," the man began to bellow, "we welcome an esteemed guest in our humble house of worship tonight." The announcement prompted a handful of worshippers to shoot a welcoming smile at me. "He's come all the way down here to the holler tonight from New York City." He talked about the place like it could have just as easily been Mars. "But he isn't no federal man coming to take away your rights. He's come to show all those tyrants in Washington that what we are doing isn't harming anybody down here in God's house. Isn't that right, brothers and sisters?" The congregation erupted in whoops and cheers of approval, and in a way, he was right. If folks were dying because they were dancing with rattlesnakes, that was undeniably tragic, but no one was forcing them to, and they weren't exactly going out of their way to hurt anyone. So for me, it really did raise the question, do we live in a free country or not? The pastor continued with his sermon for a spell, then after ushering in another musical number, walked down the center row of seats to greet me. But as he got within arm's reach, Tack exploded in a flurry of furious barks. "Tack," I growled at him, "quiet, boy." But Tack just would not stop. He barked so loud and so intensely that some of the worshippers were turning to us with angry looks on their faces. "Brother, I really must insist you tie that thing up outside," Pastor Childers said, his cheerful demeanor slipping a little as he spoke. Normally, if someone spoke about Tack like that, I'd tell them to kick rocks, but this was work, so I made an exception. I took Tack outside and asked what the hell had gotten into him. Then, for the first time since the day we had both been wounded in combat, he alerted. There were no booby traps here, no Viet Cong to worry about, but he still told me danger was present. I was concerned, but I had not come too far just to turn back. I told him to stay and assured him I'd be back in a moment. Tack laid down, shooting me a frightened look, but did as he was told. "Must be that he can smell the snake on me," the pastor said when I re-entered the tent. At the time, that made all the sense in the world to me, and since he had given me a conversational window into asking him about snakes, I took the initiative. "My snakes really bite," he said with a warm smile. "They sure got the devil in them, all serpents do, but Satan's power is weakest here in the Lord's house. However, on the occasion they do bite, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." That being said, he broke off, turning his neck to one side, revealing 2 dark pinprick scars upon his throat. To my knowledge, no one had ever survived being bitten on the neck by an eastern diamondback, yet here stood this pastor, living, breathing proof that it was possible. Only that wasn't quite his version of events. When I asked him how he survived, his response was cryptic, to say the least. "That's just the thing, brother," he said. "I didn't." When I asked him what he meant by that, the pastor called out to one of his congregation. "Brother Robert," he yelled, "show our guest here how we are unafraid." I watched in disbelief as a boy no older than 20 fetched a wicker basket from one side of the stage before pulling out the biggest rattlesnake I'd ever laid eyes on. Then, in rhythm with the singing and clapping of the congregation, he started bouncing this thing up and down in his grip. I expected that the rattler would just wheel around and bite him in an instant, but to my amazement, it looked completely disinterested. My jaw is on the floor as I am trying to figure out if it's the music, the rhythmic bouncing, or if these snakes have been sedated before the service. And I only snap out of it when I hear the pastor speak again. "You see, brother," he hissed into my ear, "you see how we got the devil on a leash?" I must admit I was impressed. Balls for picking up a rattlesnake like that, but it didn't seem the least bit interested in biting him. I had to drag myself out of that awestruck stupor to get the interview back on track. I finally asked him what he meant when he said he didn't survive the snake bite. He just looked at me and grinned, his lips squirming like the truth was on the tip of his tongue. But all that came out was a Bible verse. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever lives by believing in me will never die. My first guess was that Pastor Childers hadn't died. More like he had miraculously survived a period of unfathomable pain and suffering and lost a little of his sanity in the process. But Pastor Childers was telling the truth. Only before I could question him any further, one of the congregation let out an ear-piercing screech. Another worshiper rushed to take control of the rattler Brother Robert had been holding, while the boy himself held out his forearm, 2 tiny droplets of blood bubbling out before running down his alabaster skin. He had been bitten. "Excuse me, brother," Pastor Childers said as pandemonium erupted, "but please come back tomorrow night. If the boy doesn't survive, he'll be resurrected. Come see, come see." And at that, he was gone, sucked into the throng of hysterical worshippers as they flocked around the venom-stricken boy. I left, disgusted at the waste of a young life, switching on my flashlight as I walked back into the darkness. "Come on, boy, let's get out of here." Tack jumped up, his tail wagging in relief before we trudged off through the trees. When I awoke the next morning, I had no intention of returning to the revival tent to watch Brother Robert's resurrection. I had seen enough medics hopelessly laboring over dead men to know that once you're gone, there's no bringing you back. Instead, I planned to check out of the motel before the long drive back to Syracuse. Only, as I was loading up my car, I heard a soft, mousy voice calling out from behind me. "Hey, mister." It was a young woman, maybe about 16 or even 17 years old. "You're headed down to the worship tonight, right?" I hadn't noticed her the night before, but evidently she had noticed me. No," I replied. "I don't know what they're going to do with that boy, but he passed," she interjected, a sadness in her eyes. "Last night, a few hours after you left, but they're going to bring him back tonight." She believed it too. You could hear it in her voice. "I'm sorry, but you can't bring people back." I felt like a major jerk saying it to her, but it was the truth, at least I thought it was. "Your pastor is a liar. He wasn't resurrected. There's no such thing." "Sure there is, mister, and you're going to tell everyone about it." I slammed my trunk shut and turned to face her. "And why would you want me to tell everyone?" I asked. "That'll mean feds crawling all over these hills. They'll arrest your pastor and take away your snakes. Because it needs to stop, all of it needs to stop." She was growing more increasingly agitated, and her voice cracked as she spoke. "What they're doing down there, it's wrong. Sure, most of the time they come back okay, but every so often, they come back different, and they've got to put them down. I don't want to see Robert like that, I just can't, but they're going to. And," I said, cutting her off before she descended into panic, "I'll head down to the tent again tonight and try to stop whatever they're going to do." "Okay, thank you, mister, thank you," the girl replied, her cheeks now slick with tears. Before I had a chance to say anything else, she was on her way. That night, me and Tack repeated the ritual of gearing up, getting in the car, and driving down to Three Forks, only this time, I had even less of an idea of what to expect. We had hit the dead end of Laurel Fork, and again walked through the drizzling rain towards where the tent had been the night before. Once again, they were expecting me, but when I entered, I found the tone to be very different than the night before. Instead of singing, dancing, and clapping, the congregation was silent, and there was a distinct tension in the air. "Ah, Pastor Childers!" I exclaimed as I walked in. "Welcome, brother. God told me you'd return, and here you are." Childers was standing over 2 white plastic camping tables, which held up Brother Robert's lifeless corpse, and it was quite evident that he was dead. He had that deathly pallor about him, that same grim jaundice I had seen so many others have in Vietnam. Behind him was the same man who had welcomed me into the tent the previous night, only this time he was carrying a shotgun. "Pastor, we need to talk." "Not now, brother. Plenty of time to talk when Brother Robert is back." Brother Robert isn't coming back, Pastor. You and I... Please, no more talking, Pastor Childers interrupted. All your doubts will be cleared soon enough. Now take your seats, brothers and sisters. The time of rebirth is upon us. Again, Tack was growling something fierce, but he kept it low, sticking close to my side as we were waiting to what was to come. We got something special here, folks, Childers began. There's something in these hills that God put here long, long ago, and we must show our gratitude for it. A smattering of amens came back from the congregation before the pastor continued. So will it be with the resurrection of the dead, he said, his voice rising with every sentence. The body that is sown is perishable, but it's raised imperishable. It's sown into dishonor, but it was raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, but it is raised in power. The congregation were calling back to him now as he motioned to a man off stage. Bring me the serpent that took this boy's life, Pastor Childers bellowed, and at his command, the man picked up the same wicker basket that Brother Robert had carried just the night before. In it was the snake that killed him, still alive and still deadly. Childers whipped open the lid, plunged his hand into the basket, and raised the snake up by its head. And as he held it up to the congregation, he produced a small knife and began to slice through the snake's throat. Once it had been decapitated, another member of the congregation appeared to be holding a large glass bowl, and the snake's blood was carefully and methodically drained into it before they continued. The pastor then placed the snake's remains on Brother Thomas's lifeless chest before taking a short step back. I declare to you, brothers and sisters, he bellowed, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. We will not sleep. We will all be changed. Changed. The congregation began to whoop and holler, and in turn, Pastor Childers' intensity began to build. In a flash, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. He was foaming at the mouth now, fire and brimstone in his words. Then, and only then, we will have the saying that will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory. As Pastor Childers ranted and raved, my attention was suddenly drawn away from him. The headless snake that lay on Robert's chest. He began to move. It was only slight at first, little twitches that could easily be mistaken as belated death throes, but soon it was unmistakable. The snake, the dead snake, was moving. Where, O death, is your victory? Childers screamed, motioning to the sheer impossibility before him. Where, O death, is your sting? And at that, the snake began to slither, stump first, into Brother Robert's open mouth and down into his throat. I could not believe what I was seeing. Watching the headless, blood-soaked snake disappear down Brother Robert's throat was the single most horrifying thing I had ever witnessed. Nothing I had seen in Nam could possibly compare, but instead of running for their lives, the congregation were in raptures. Some were weeping, others spoke in tongues. The rest simply stood there, as in a deep trance, swaying from side to side. Me, on the other hand, it was like I was dumbstruck. I was glued to that spot, just clamoring to comprehend what the hell I was seeing. Then, when I thought things couldn't get any more insane, Brother Robert woke up. Tack was just about losing his mind at this point, unleashing a flurry of high-pitched whines as he tugged at the sleeve of my jacket. He was begging me to leave, but I just couldn't. I remember putting a hand on my mouth in pure shock, watching as Brother Robert coughed, sputtered, and gasped for air. He looked terrified, his sunken eyes wide and fearful, and they darted around the room in confusion. The congregation spilled out of their seats toward him. People were weeping. Others cried out, "Hallelujah!" The joy they felt was otherworldly, and as Brother Robert embraced his loved ones after a long, deep sleep, he began to smile. All eyes were on Robert's. Not a single person wanted this moment to be missed. This miracle of a resurrection. All except one. The girl who had visited me at the motel. She was staring at me, the desperate look in her eyes that screamed for God's sake to do something. But I didn't have anything to do because Robert did it for me. "Give me some room," Pastor Childers cried out. Let me welcome our dear brother back into the land of the living." The congregation rescinded like waves from a beach, allowing Childers to get face to face with the still smiling Robert. Only as I watched him approach, I noticed there was something horribly wrong about Robert's face. His eyes were wide open, almost like he didn't have any eyelids at all, and his smile was stretched so unnaturally wide that I swear you could see every single one of his teeth. It wasn't a happy smile, it was something else, something terrifying. "Robert," Childers asked. "It's me, Pastor Childers. I want to—" Childers was silenced by the lightning-fast movement of Robert's arms. In an instant, his hands were wrapped around the pastor's throat. He gasped for air as the congregation leapt to his defense, trying to pry Robert's hands off of his neck. But it was no good. For a man who had been clinically deceased just a few moments before, Robert was horrifyingly strong. And we all heard the moment he crushed the pastor's larynx with a sickening crunch. Robert then swung the pastor around, knocking down several of the congregation as he flung the man's limp body in the direction. "Robert, no! What in God's name are you doing?" Yet it was as if he could not hear them. He simply grabbed another member of the congregation and sunk his teeth into her face. The scream she let out was gut-wrenching, punctuated by the sound of a shotgun shell racking into the chamber. "Get the hell off of her, Robert," the armed man roared, aiming the barrel squarely at his head. Robert let go, spitting out the chewed remains of her nose on the earthen floor of the tent, and with that same sick smile splitting his face into two, he slowly turned back towards the armed man. "Please, Robert," he said. "Please, snap out of it." Robert responded by taking a few slow steps toward him before suddenly and violently lunging. Buckshot tore through the right side of Robert's skull, popping it open like a smashed watermelon. The boy stood there for a moment, staggering to and fro, and then it looked like he was about to drop. Then, out of nowhere, Robert once again lunged towards the man, grabbing hold of the shotgun and using it as leverage to smash what remained of his forehead into the man's mouth. He fell back, letting go of the shotgun, blood pouring from his pulverized lips. Robert had racked around into the shotgun, a percussive hit to the melody of the downed man's pleas for his life. Some of his teeth fell out of his mouth as he begged. Robert aimed the shotgun square at the man's hands, clasped together in a prayer, and fired. The man howled as everything above the wrist simply disintegrated, all while the congregation and I begged Robert to come to his senses. Instead, he racked another round into the chamber, aimed the shotgun at the wounded man's head, and fired. The sound of his scream degenerating into a gurgle still haunts my nightmares, and that was the moment I came to my own senses and got the hell out of that revival tent. "Run, boy, run!" I screamed, but Tack did not need to be told. He bolted on ahead as the sounds of the unfolding massacre echoed through the trees behind us. And here's where I bring up my wounded leg. Remember the one I told you about 12 pages back? It means I can't run very far or very fast, and we ended up paying for it because at one point, I looked back to see something catching up to us. I think it's another survivor from the tent, but when I turn, all I see is Brother Robert hurling towards me, shotgun in hand. He pumps one final round into the chamber, raises the shotgun, and then something else tears past me in the darkness. It was Tack, barreling towards the thing that used to be Brother Robert, and with his good eye, it tracked Tack as he leapt towards him and took its last shot. The next thing I see is Brother Robert in the dirt, and Tack has him by the throat, whipping his neck back and forth, chewing and piercing, drowning Robert in his own blood. At first I didn't think that'd finish him off, but when Tack climbed off of him and Robert ceased to move, I breathed a deep sigh of relief. But it was one taken far too soon. No sooner than I had said, "Good boy," Tack collapsed to the ground. The thing that used to be Robert had indeed landed his final shot, filling Tack's gut full of buckshot in the seconds before he delivered the killer blow. I went to autopilot, picked Tack up, and ran as fast as I could back to the car, driving like a man possessed, not even sure where I was headed. I just remember looking over at him at one point to see if he was still alive, if he was still with me, and he was gone. His big brown eyes stared off into oblivion. I pulled the car over to the side of the highway and burst into tears. I never loved anything in my whole life like I loved that dog after we got back from Nam, and the things had gotten bad for a while. He was the only thing that kept me from eating my gun. Every single time I thought about ending it, I think, who's going to feed Tack? And that was that. All the guys whose lives he had saved, they'd kick my ass if they knew I'd ever dared to mistreat him. He was my best friend in the world, and now he was gone. I tried and failed to save his life, just like he had saved mine that day in the jungle, and just like he did that day in Three Forks, and that's just something I must live with. I couldn't bring myself to write up the story. I just apologized to my editor and told him I had to pass on it. After all, who in their right minds would believe me? When he asked about what happened in Kentucky, I just told him it was a hunting accident. A few years later, I took a job down in Florida, working as the sports correspondent for the Gainesville Sun, and I ended up retiring here too. I mean to go back to Three Forks one day to really address what happened. Just not yet. Not yet. I have a new dog these days, also ex-military, and he's also a German Shepherd. I think he takes more care of me than I take care of him at this point, and he certainly makes for better company than my ex-wife. As for a name, I call him Junior, and I don't think I have to tell you who that's after. It was a typical chilly night at our campsite, nestled deep within the woods. The sky was sprinkled with stars, and the campfire crackled, casting flickering shadows on everyone's faces. My friends and I were huddled around the fire, roasting marshmallows and swapping ghost stories. Despite the spooky tales, the warmth of the fire and the laughter made everything feel safe and cozy. Just as I was about to take another bite of my s'more, I felt an urgent need to use the restroom. "I'll be right back," I mumbled, standing up. The nearest restroom was a quarter-mile away down a narrow, winding path that disappeared into the darkness beyond our campfire's glow. I grabbed a flashlight and started walking. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it couldn't chase away the eerie feeling that crept up my spine. Every rustle in the bushes and every snap of a twig made my heart jump. I told myself it was just the wind or a small animal, nothing to be scared of. As I continued down the path, the outline of someone walking ahead caught my eye. It looked like one of my friends from the campsite. He had a peculiar way of walking, kind of a shuffle with one foot dragging slightly. I called out, "Hey, wait up!" but he didn't stop. Instead, he looked back and shouted, "Why are you following me?" His voice sounded strained, almost scared. That was weird. I quickened my pace to catch up, keeping the beam of my flashlight steady on the path ahead. "I told you guys I was just going to the bathroom," I yelled back. But he didn't wait. He turned and started walking faster, and then, just like that, he was gone, swallowed up by the dark. When I finally reached the restroom, I was a little out of breath and a lot spooked. I did my business quickly, half expecting a ghost to pop out at any minute. The walk back to the campsite was even creepier. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see my friend, or whoever it was, following me. But there was only darkness and the distant sound of laughter from the campfire. When I got back, I walked straight to my friend, the one I thought I had seen on the path. He was sitting by the fire, roasting another marshmallow, acting as if he'd been there the whole time. "Were you just on the path to the restroom?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He looked up, puzzled. "No, I've been here the whole time. Why? What's up?" I glanced around at my other friends. They all nodded, agreeing with him. "But I saw someone, it looked just like you," I stammered, feeling a bit foolish. They all laughed. "Probably just your imagination, or maybe you saw a ghost," one friend teased, winking. I forced a laugh and sat back down, poking at the fire with a stick. Maybe they were right. It was probably just my imagination running wild in the dark. But still, a nagging feeling told me something strange was going on. I decided to keep it to myself for now, not wanting to be the joke of the night. But deep down, I couldn't shake off the chill that had nothing to do with the night air. After the strange happenings earlier that night, I tried to convince myself everything was normal. I joined in the laughter and stories, but I couldn't completely relax. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, still puzzled, and fell into a fitful sleep. In what felt like just minutes later, I woke up again. My watch showed it was 3 a.m., and once again, I needed to use the bathroom. I didn't want to trek all the way to the restroom, so I decided to just walk a little into the woods. I slipped on my shoes and quietly unzipped my tent, trying not to wake anyone else. The woods were even quieter at this hour, and a thin mist had settled around the campsite, making everything look ghostly. I shivered, more from the eerie silence than the cold, and headed into the trees. After I was done, I started back toward the campsite. That's when I heard it, the distinct sound of a tent zipper. I turned my head just in time to see my friend, the same one I thought I saw earlier, stepping out of his tent. He pulled out a cigarette and his lighter. The sparks from the lighter briefly lit up his face in the darkness, giving him a spooky look. "Can you hear me?" he called out softly, almost a whisper. I stopped walking, confused. "Yeah, I can hear you. What's up?" I replied, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Can you hear me?" he asked again, this time much louder. It was as if he was talking to someone far away, not just to me. "Yeah. What are you trying to do? Wake everyone up?" I said, a little annoyed. He just shook his head and walked towards the cars parked a little way off from our tents. Curious and a bit worried, I followed him. The mist made it hard to see, and he seemed to be just a shadow moving ahead of me. When I reached the cars, he was nowhere to be seen. I looked around, bewildered and not a little scared. "This isn't funny anymore," I called out, but there was no answer. Frustrated and feeling a bit foolish, I walked back to his tent. It was zipped up, and I could hear faint snoring from inside. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of things. Was I dreaming? Seeing things? Or was something weird really happening? Too wired to sleep, I returned to my tent, but I didn't close my eyes again that night. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the night and wondering about what I'd seen and heard. It seemed impossible, but I was sure of what I'd experienced. The next morning, I watched as my friend climbed out of his tent, stretching and yawning like it was just another day. I wanted to ask him again, to see if he'd admit to anything now in the daylight, but something in his normal, sleepy expression stopped me. Maybe I'd just imagined it all. But the memory of that night stayed with me, a mystery that wouldn't quite let me go. I knew something strange had happened, even if I couldn't explain it. As I pushed past the low-hanging branches at the edge of Ocala National Forest, the scent of pine and damp earth hit me. The forest, cloaked in its perpetual shadow, stretched endlessly before us, an impenetrable wall of green that had swallowed up countless sunsets. It was the kind of place you could get lost in without ever straying from a path, the kind of place that kept its secrets close. My buddy Mike, a sturdy guy with a keen eye for tracking, led the way with his usual brisk pace. "We're gonna find some good spots tonight, I can feel it," he said, adjusting the strap of his AR-15 on his shoulder. I nodded, feeling the familiar weight of my own rifle and the sidearm at my hip. We were equipped for hogs but prepared for anything. The deeper we ventured, the thicker the woods seemed to become. Ancient oaks twisted high above, their limbs weaving a dense tapestry that blotted out the moon. Only thin shards of light managed to pierce the canopy, casting eerie shadows that danced around our feet. It was well past midnight, and by my reckoning, we were about 3 or 4 miles from the main road, deeper than we'd planned to go. "We should have turned back an hour ago," I muttered, checking my watch. The digital glow seemed out of place in the timeless dark of the Ocala. Mike chuckled softly. "Where's your sense of adventure, man? Besides, we're not the type to shy away from a little darkness." True enough. With our gear, our skills, and the moon providing just enough light to navigate, I felt a surge of confidence. We were hunters after all, descendants of a long line of humans who knew how to tread softly and strike fast. But there was something about Ocala that made you feel small, a whisper in your ear that you were never truly alone. As we moved, the silence of the night was suddenly shattered by a rustling to our right. It was heavy, deliberate, the sound of something big pushing through the underbrush. My heart kicked against my ribs as I instinctively reached for my rifle. "Hold up," Mike said, his voice low. He gestured for me to switch on the flashlight. We opted against the mounted lights on our rifles to avoid startling whatever it was. Maybe it was just a deer, or at the very least a bear. I clicked on the flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. We stood still, listening as the rustling grew louder, closer. Whatever it was moving fast, heading straight for the trail ahead of us. I braced myself, ready to catch sight of a hog or a startled deer. But instead, there was nothing. Nothing but the quick flash of what looked like white legs crossing the trail some 50 feet up. Human legs, it seemed, pale and bare against the dark undergrowth. "What the hell?" Mike whispered. My thoughts exactly. What kind of person would be out here crashing through the woods in the middle of the night? We had a choice then, to follow the strange sighting and delve deeper into the unknown, or turn back and admit defeat. We chose to press on, our curiosity now as sharp as our blades. The rest of the journey was marked by occasional sounds from the woods around us, a reminder that we weren't alone. But we saw no further sign of the mysterious Nightwalker. Each step took us deeper into the heart of Ocala, deeper into its secrets. As the night wore on, the forest seemed less like a place on a map and more like a living, breathing entity, watching us with unseen eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that Ocala wasn't just keeping its secrets, it was whispering them, one rustling leaf at a time. And I was listening, whether I wanted to or not. The trail became a narrow gash in the earth, winding its way through towering pines that seemed to lean in, curious about the interlopers in their midst. My boots crunched softly on the bed of pine needles, the sound almost devoured by the thick silence that enveloped us. Mike was ahead, his outline a ghostly shadow against the dark backdrop of the woods. We hadn't spoken much since seeing those white legs flit across the trail. The image lingered in my mind, unsettling in its ambiguity. Was it a prank, a lost hiker, or something else? Something that didn't want to be found? The deeper we walked into Ocala, the more I felt the latter might be true. Our flashlights bobbed with our steps, twin beams that carved out small islands of light in the ocean of darkness. Every rustle, every snap of a twig underfoot seemed amplified. I kept my rifle close, the grip reassuring against my palm. "We should be nearing the car soon," Mike said over his shoulder, his voice barely above a whisper as if afraid to break the night's spell. I nodded, though he couldn't see it. The promise of returning to the familiar cramped space of my old Ford was a welcome one. As much as I loved the hunt, tonight had woven a thread of unease through the thrill. Finally, the outline of my car materialized through the trees, untouched and solitary under the watchful eyes of the forest. A wave of relief washed over me. We quickened our pace, our beams of light swinging wildly in our haste. As we stowed our gear in the trunk, the silence of Ocala seemed to press in on us, dense and expectant. I glanced around, half expecting to see a figure standing at the edge of the light, watching us. But there was only the forest and the night. We climbed into the car, the interior a bubble of mundane safety compared to the wild outside. I started the engine, the purr of the motor a comforting sound. Mike fiddled with the radio, settling on some late-night talk show that filled the cabin with inane chatter. But as we drove down the forest road, the headlights caught something, a figure walking along the roadside. It was a man, his shirt a checkerboard of light and shadow, wearing shorts and no gear, no flashlight. "That's got to be the guy we saw earlier," Mike murmured, his tone a mix of disbelief and curiosity. The man didn't look up as we passed, just kept walking with a steady, purposeful stride. Where could he be going? There was nothing for miles, no reason for him to be out here. It didn't make sense. As the road straightened and we neared the paved exit of the forest, the man vanished from view. Mike and I exchanged a look, questions unspoken but hanging heavy between us. The rest of the drive was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. The encounter had cast a shadow over the night, turning an otherwise successful hunt into a puzzle we couldn't solve. I dropped Mike off at his place with a casual wave, the night's events still swirling in my mind. As I drove home, the empty streets of my small town seemed eerily similar to the dark paths of Ocala. Quiet, deserted, and full of secrets. I knew one thing for certain. I'd be back. Not just for the thrill of the hunt, but to unravel the mystery of what, or who, was sharing the forest with us. Sometimes you hear stories that you just can't shake off, no matter how hard you try. That's exactly what happened with the story Jay told me one chilly evening as we sat curled up on the couch, sipping hot cocoa. Jay, my boyfriend, had always been interested in all things spooky, and I guess that's one reason we clicked, because I'm pretty open to that sort of stuff too. Jay had this old intriguing tale about his childhood, one that involved a dusty old Ouija board he found in his grandma's attic. He was just about my age then, maybe a bit older, always looking for adventures or something mysterious to solve. But this wasn't just any adventure. It was one that he'd remember forever, and not in a good way. He told me how he had dusted off the board, the letters almost faded, and the planchette, a little pointer, quite wobbly. Despite the eerie feeling it gave him, curiosity won over, and he decided to play with it, alone. He asked it silly questions at first, like if he'd pass his math test, or if any girl in his class liked him. But then, he asked it if anyone was there with him. The planchette moved to yes. That was the start of everything. From that exact day, Jay said his life changed. It was like he had opened a door he couldn't close. Weird things began to happen. He would hear his name whispered when no one was home. Doors would slam shut, and sometimes his things would go missing only to turn up in odd places. At night, it felt as if someone was watching him, and not in a protective guardian angel kind of way, but something more sinister. Listening to him, I felt a chill run down my spine. I believed in spiritual stuff, yes, but Jay's story seemed like something straight out of a horror movie. Despite my fears, I couldn't help but be drawn into his world, wondering about the unseen and the unexplained. As Jay's story unfolded, I found myself looking around our cozy living room, half expecting to see something uncanny. But all that greeted me was the soft glow of our lamps and the comforting crackle of the fire. Yet something about Jay's tale made the room feel colder, the shadows darker. I never touched a Ouija board again after that, Jay concluded, staring deep into his mug as if it held some secret. I reached out, squeezing his hand, trying to bring him back from the haunting memories. The rest of the evening, we switched gears and decided to listen to some creepy encounter podcasts, which we both loved. But in the back of my mind, Jay's story lingered, making each podcast feel a little more real, a little more possible. What if these things weren't just stories? What if something really was out there, just beyond the edge of what we could see and understand? As we settled in for the night, those thoughts swirled in my mind, unsettling yet oddly thrilling. Little did I know, the night was about to take a turn, bringing Jay's stories terrifyingly close to reality. That night, after listening to a couple of spooky podcasts, Jay and I decided to switch to watching some scary stories on YouTube to wind down before bed. It sounds weird, right? Watching scary things to wind down. But for us, it was our way of relaxing. It was like riding a roller coaster from the safety of our couch. But what happened next wasn't something we could have ever predicted. We were halfway through a particularly creepy story when a scream shattered the quiet of our room. It was distant yet clear, cutting through the narrator's voice on the TV. It sounded like a little girl's cry for help coming from somewhere outside in the dark. I looked at Jay, my eyes wide with fear, and he paused the video. We listened, holding our breaths. There it was again, the same scream. Only this time it seemed closer, more desperate. I felt a chill run down my spine. Jay muted the TV, and we sat in silence, straining our ears against the stillness of the night. The scream came again, and it was unmistakable this time. It wasn't just our imagination. Suddenly, our cats, who had been sleeping peacefully at our feet, jumped up. Their backs arched, and they hissed towards the front door, their eyes fixed on something we couldn't see. Their reaction made my heart race even faster. Animals are supposed to sense things humans can't, right? What were they seeing that we couldn't? Before we could comfort them, a new sound began. It started as a soft tapping, like fingertips drumming against the window pane. Then it grew louder and more insistent, as if someone, or something, was tapping on every window and door around the house. Tap, tap, tap. It went on, a sinister rhythm that seemed to echo the beating of my own heart. "Should we check it out?" Jay whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, let's just stay here," I replied, my voice shaking. I wasn't about to go anywhere near those doors or windows, not with that tapping, not with those screams. We decided to hide under the bed, which might seem silly, but it felt like the only safe place at that moment. We crawled underneath, pulling a couple of blankets with us. Lying there, in the cramped, dusty space, I held Jay's hand tightly. Tears rolled down my cheeks as I tried to stifle my sobs. I was scared that whatever was outside could hear us, could sense our fear. The tapping continued for what felt like hours. Tap, tap, tap. It was relentless. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. It was heavy, filled with anticipation of what might come next. We didn't dare move. We stayed under the bed, holding each other, waiting for the sun to rise. Neither of us spoke much. What was there to say? In that moment, we both understood the reality of fear. Not just the kind you hear in stories, but the deep, primal fear that makes you realize how vulnerable you really are. As dawn finally broke and the first light crept into the room, we finally allowed ourselves to breathe. Whatever had visited us that night had gone, leaving us with nothing but the echoes of our own fear. But the question remained, what was it? And more importantly, would it come back? Life, as they say, can turn on a dime. For me, it seemed to turn on every restless thought and every sigh that escaped my lips in the silence of our too-empty house. That Sunday night, the world outside was alive with the usual hum of the main road, a constant reminder that life went on, bustling and busy, just beyond my front door. Across the street, the high school stood like a sentinel, dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos within its walls during the day. My wife, Emily, had gone to stay with her mother in a neighboring city a few weeks ago. We were taking a break, a phrase that felt like a thin veil over a gaping wound. Our conversations had become minefields, our home a battleground of silent treatments and whispered grievances. She left in search of peace, I suppose. And me? I was left grappling with the pieces, trying to forge some semblance of normalcy in the echoing spaces of our once shared life. The kids were tucked in bed, their gentle breathing a rhythmic comfort as I moved through the motions of organizing our home. Boxes, once packed with the optimism of a family making a new start, now stood as monuments to our fragmented reality, stacked neatly by the front door. I had decided to unpack them, not because they needed unpacking, but because the task gave me a sense of purpose, a distraction from the heavy cloak of loneliness that had settled around my shoulders. It was late, maybe too late for the noise I was making, but the emptiness of the house swallowed the sounds, leaving behind a quiet that was too loud in its silence. I was winding down, my thoughts turning to the week ahead, when a sound sliced through the night, so out of place it made my heart stop. A baby crying. At first I thought it might be a trick of my weary mind, a phantom wail born from too many sleepless nights. But there it was again, a clear, sharp cry that seemed to come from just outside. I froze, listening, trying to make sense of it. My children, 6 and 9, were far past the age of nighttime cries. A chill ran down my spine as I moved toward the door, driven by a mixture of concern and a growing unease. Peeking out, the night greeted me with its cool indifference. The street was empty, the usual nighttime quiet settling over the neighborhood like a thick fog. But as I strained my eyes in the dim light, I saw it. An unsettling, misshapen figure shuffling up the sidewalk. It was too far to discern details, but it was definitely not human. Not anymore, if it ever was. I stepped outside, the door slamming shut behind me in my haste. The sound seemed to startle the creature. It paused, turning its head in my direction. Heart pounding, I could only stare as it faced me. The details of its form were obscured by the shadows, but the feeling of wrongness it projected was palpable. Panicked, I retreated back inside, slamming the door and locking it. My mind raced as I backed away from the door, trying to process what I had just seen. It wasn't just fear that gripped me, it was the realization that my understanding of the world, of what was possible and what wasn't, had just expanded in a way I was not prepared to handle. I grabbed a machete from the utility closet, a laughable defense perhaps, but it was something. As I stood there, weapon in hand, the silence of the house now seemed oppressive, suffocating. I was alone, truly alone, and for the first time the weight of that solitude felt like it might just crush me. The moments after I slammed the door shut felt longer than any I'd experienced before. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain it could be heard throughout the quiet house. The machete felt clumsy in my hand, a poor substitute for actual safety. Yet it was all I had to defend myself against whatever was out there. I stood there, frozen, listening intently for any signs of movement outside. The soft ticking of the kitchen clock mocked the rapid pace of my pulse. I was expecting to hear the shuffle of footsteps, the scraping of claws, or the ominous silence broken by another cry. Instead, there came a different sound. A heavy, deliberate set of footsteps that seemed too rhythmic and solid to belong to anything human. They sounded like hooves, clicking against the concrete of our front walk in a steady, haunting cadence. Minutes stretched into an eternity as I waited, every sense strained in the heavy silence of my fortress of solitude. Finally, when I could stand the suspense no longer, I edged toward the door, machete gripped tightly. I peered through the peephole, but saw nothing but the shadows of the night. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and pulled it open with a swift, determined motion. What greeted me was chaos. The neat stack of boxes I had earlier arranged so meticulously was now a sprawled mess across the driveway. Boxes were torn open, their contents strewn about like the aftermath of some bizarre tantrum. The night air was still, with no sign of the creature that had caused such disarray. I stepped outside, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, any hint of the misshapen figure I had seen earlier. But there was nothing, just the ordinary night sounds of a town at rest, as if the world were wholly unaware of the terror that had visited my doorstep. Over the next few days, the weight of what had happened bore down on me. I found myself jumping at shadows, every sound making me tense and ready for a confrontation that never came. My sleep was fitful, filled with nightmares that left me waking in a cold sweat. During the day, I scoured the internet for any explanation, any similar experiences that could tell me what I had encountered. That's when I stumbled upon tales of skinwalkers, creatures from Native American lore said to be able to transform into, possess, or disguise themselves as animals. Could my emotional turmoil have attracted such a being? Was it possible that these entities were drawn to the lonely and the broken-hearted, feeding off their despair? The thought was both terrifying and strangely validating. It meant I wasn't crazy, that perhaps there was more to my experience than just an overactive imagination fueled by stress and fear. As the days turned into weeks, the immediate fear began to dull, replaced by a lingering caution and a deep-seated curiosity. I was more aware, more watchful, no longer the passive observer of my own life, but an active participant in a mysterious, unseen world. I decided to share my story, not just as a warning to others, but as a way to find connection and perhaps answers. If anything, I hope that by reaching out, by exposing my vulnerability and fear, I might find others who had witnessed the inexplicable, who could offer understanding or, at the very least, the comfort of shared experience. It was a step towards healing, towards reclaiming the peace that had been so brutally disrupted that unsettling night.